The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried inside an envelope of such startling quality that it seemed an outright affront to the stained pine of the rented table where Edith Reeve ate her solitary meals, mended her solitary stockings, and quietly, carefully rationed what remained of her life. The paper was thick as cream, the seal pressed in a deep and unforgiving blue, bearing a coronet she did not recognize, and for a long moment she simply looked at it, turning it over in her hands with the careful, measured attention of a woman who had learned that news in her life was rarely good, and never grand. News, in her experience, arrived in the form of a butcher's bill, a note from her landlady concerning the damp that crept along the scullery wall with patient malice, or a letter from her late husband's cousin inquiring, with the tedious politeness of a man who already knew the answer, after her dwindling finances. She was 28 years old. She was a widow. She was a woman of good sense and absolutely no prospects, and she had begun to understand, with the cold clarity of someone who refuses to look away from the arithmetic of her own life, that good sense without resources is simply a more refined form of desperation. She slit the seal with the small practical knife she used for her mending, and the handwriting within was a testament to a bygone age, a spidery, elegant script full of sharp peaks and graceful loops, penned by a hand that had never in its long life known a single day of physical labor. Mrs. Reeve, it began without preamble and without apology. I am informed by my man of business in London that you are a gentlewoman of good sense and practical nature, lately widowed and seeking a situation. He speaks of your character in terms that, for a lawyer, verge on the effusive. I am in need of a companion. My health is variable. My disposition, I am told, is not. The country air here in Yorkshire is bracing. The society is non-existent, which I count as a considerable blessing. My offer is £300 per annum, with all lodging and board provided at my estate Westbourne. Your duties will be light. Your primary responsibility will be to endure me. There is the matter of my great-nephew, the Duke of Whitchurch, whose house this is. You will find him private. His seclusion is a matter of long establishment. It need not concern you. I require your services to commence at your earliest convenience. A coach will be arranged upon receipt of your acceptance. Aura, Dowager Duchess of Whitchurch. Edith read the letter twice, and then a third time, and then she set it on the stained table and looked at it as though it were a creature of an entirely different species from herself. £300. It was a fortune. It was independence, which was a word she had not allowed herself to think in months, because thinking about independence when you have none is a form of exquisite torture that a practical woman cannot afford. It was the end of the cloying, suffocating pity in her relation's eyes. It was the end of the careful arithmetic she performed each evening, tallying her widow's portion against her expenses and finding the margin grow smaller with every passing week. And it was, she told herself firmly, simply a job in Yorkshire, working for an old woman with a variable constitution. She did not allow herself to think very much about the Duke. The phrase "his seclusion is a matter of long establishment" was, she recognized immediately, a masterpiece of aristocratic understatement. It was a door firmly closed. It was a warning carefully wrapped in good manners. It meant something had happened, something dark and unspoken, something that had swallowed a man and left only his title behind. Edith, whose own life had been shaped by sudden loss, who knew the precise geography of grief and the peculiar way it hollows a person from the inside out, was not afraid of sorrow. What she was afraid of was poverty. What she was afraid of was the slow, creeping erosion of her own personhood into a state of dependency, into becoming a burden, into the gradual disappearance of the self that Arthur had loved, and that she had, in her better moments, respected. Arthur Reeve had been a physician of modest practice and generous spirit, a man who brought his work home in his coat pockets, alongside strange medical curiosities and an inexhaustible supply of terrible jokes, and whose sudden death from a fever contracted from one of his own patients had been, in the most brutal and literal sense, an amputation. She had been 26. She had packed away his medical texts alongside her own volumes of poetry on the same shelf, where they had remained side by side ever since, and she had understood that the particular kind of companionship they had shared, the kind built on genuine intellectual respect and quiet mutual delight, was not a thing she was likely to find again. She had decided, a practical woman. Practical women survived. She dipped her pen and wrote her acceptance before she could examine her reasons too carefully, and she told the Dowager Duchess that she could be ready to travel within a week. The week passed in the businesslike flurry of a woman who has learned not to be sentimental about things she cannot afford to keep. She settled her accounts, packed her trunks, sold the furniture she could not take with her, and stood at last in the small empty room with Arthur's desk gone and the key cold in her hand, and felt a single, sharp, undeniable pang of pure fear. She was stepping off the edge of her known world. Then the coach arrived, and it was not merely a coach, it was a statement, lacquered in a black so deep it seemed to drink the morning light, the ducal crest on the door picked out in gold, drawn by 4 perfectly matched greys, whose breath rose in the autumn air like small prayers, and the world of Westbourne reached out across the distance and claimed her before she had even agreed to be claimed. If you have ever wondered what it feels like to leave everything behind and step into a story you cannot yet read, stay with me, because this is where Edith Reeve's real life began, and what she found at the end of that long road north was something neither the Dowager's careful letter nor her own considerable imagination had prepared her for. The journey took 3 days. England unrolled outside her window in long, slow measures, the tidy, domesticated fields of the south giving way gradually to something starker and more honest, the hills rising and the skies widening and the light taking on a particular quality that felt less like weather and more like a temperament. The roads grew rougher as they moved north, the comfortable world of posting inns and well-maintained turnpikes giving way to something older and less apologetic, and by the time the coach turned off the main road and onto a private drive through gates of magnificent wrought iron, sagging slightly on their hinges and green all over with lichen, Edith had the distinct impression of crossing a border. The drive beyond the gates was deeply rutted, the great oaks and beeches that lined it growing far too close, their branches tangling overhead in a long cathedral arch of darkening green, and the parkland on either side was beautiful in the way that only deeply neglected things can be beautiful. The grass grown high, the bracken creeping in from the margins, ancient trees standing in their own shadows like old men who have forgotten they were once young. It was an estate of immense proportions and immense systematic neglect, a place that had been left to its own devices for so long it had begun to develop opinions, and the opinion it held was one of proud, melancholy seclusion. Then the house appeared, and Edith felt the breath go out of her. Westbourne was not beautiful, it was magnificent, which is a different and more demanding quality. A vast, sprawling edifice of grey stone built over the course of centuries by people who had very strong feelings. About permanence, it commanded the surrounding landscape with a brooding, unapologetic dominance, its multitude of windows staring out like blank eyes, keeping their counsel. Only a small cluster of rooms in the west wing showed any warmth, any sign of habitation. The pale gold of firelight visible in 2 or 3 windows against the early dusk. The rest of the house was shuttered, dark, draped, as if in mourning for itself or for its master, or for something that had happened to both of them a long time ago and had never quite been resolved. The butler who opened the great oak doors was named Graves, and he had the particular quality of very old family retainers, the quality of being simultaneously a person and an institution, and his voice when he said, "Welcome to Westbourne, Mrs. Reeve," was the voice of a house acknowledging its own history. He led her through an entrance hall of breathtaking proportions, 2 stories rising to a coffered ceiling from which a vast, dust-shrouded chandelier hung like a fossil from a previous era, the air cold and still, and smelling of stone and beeswax, and the particular dry silence of rooms that have not been properly lived in for a very long time. They passed closed door after closed door, the portraits of long-dead Bowhursts watching her progress from the shadows, with painted eyes that followed and judged and did not forgive, and the silence was the deepest Edith had ever experienced in a building, not the peaceful silence of rest, but the weighted, accumulated silence of grief, of absence, of a house holding its breath and waiting for something it had given up expecting. The Dowager Duchess's rooms were a shock and a revelation. Where everything else in Westbourne was dim and cold and suspended, this chamber blazed with life. A fire roared in the hearth. Every surface was occupied by books, needlework, porcelain figures, pots of flowering plants, letters in various states of reply, and an impressive collection of decorative objects that suggested a woman who had spent 80-odd years acquiring things she found interesting and had never once felt the need to justify her taste to anyone. In the center of this magnificent chaos sat Lady Hortense Bowhurst, Dowager Duchess of Whitchurch, who was tiny and ancient and dressed in severe black silk that made the diamonds at her throat seem incandescent, and whose eyes, a startling undimmed blue, were the most alert, unsentimental eyes Edith had ever encountered in a human face. She assessed Edith from across the room, with the frank, comprehensive gaze of a woman who has lived long enough to have stopped pretending that social politeness is more useful than accurate observation. "You are younger than I expected," the Dowager said. "I am 28, Your Grace," Edith replied, and gave a small, composed curtsy. "An excellent age," Lady Hortense said, with the brisk satisfaction of someone ticking an item off a list. "Old enough to have sense, young enough not to be set in your ways. Sit down, child. The journey is a trial. You will take tea." She did not say this as an invitation. She said it as a statement of fact about what was going to happen, and Edith sat. They talked, or rather the Dowager questioned and Edith answered, and the quality of Edith's answers passed some test the old woman had devised. Because gradually the thin, assessing tension in Lady Hortense's posture eased into something that was not quite approval, but was oriented in that direction. She asked about Arthur's medical practice, about what Edith had learned from it, about whether she knew anything useful about herbs or tinctures, or the management of an elderly constitution that was, as the Dowager put it, performing its final inconvenient act of persistence. "I know how to listen," Edith said, when she had described what she could offer. "That is the most important thing Arthur ever taught me, not the medicine, the listening." Lady Hortense gave a short, sharp nod. "A lost art," she said. "Most people simply wait for their turn to speak." Then her gaze moved to the fire, and something shifted in her face, a private sorrow so practiced it had become structural, built into the architecture of her expression. "Westbourne is not what it was," she said. "This house was the heart of the county once. There was music, there was laughter. There were 300 guests at midsummer, and the drive was lit with lanterns all the way to the gates." She was quiet for a moment. "Now it sleeps, as does its master." She turned back to Edith, and her blue eyes were very direct. "My letter was a polite fiction," she said. "The truth is this: a war I never understood stole the boy I knew, and sent back a duke, a title in the shape of a man. My great-nephew William went to the peninsula at 22 with a full complement of limbs, and a soul full of something resembling hope, and what came back to me at 32 was a man who has been performing the act of being alive without any particular commitment to it, for the better part of a decade." She paused, and her fingers, heavy with rings, tightened on the arm of her chair. "He lost his arm in the final year of the war. He lost something harder to name somewhere in the years before that. I have watched him disappear into this house, room by room, until now he occupies only the north wing and speaks to no one but his valet and his man of business. I am 81 years old, Mrs. Reeve. I cannot reach him. I have been trying for 10 years, and I cannot reach him. I brought you here because I am running out of time and running out of ideas, and I needed someone different, someone who does not know him as he was, and therefore cannot mourn the distance between that and what he has become. She looked at Edith with an expression that was simultaneously imperious and desperate, the look of a woman who has never asked for help in her life and is not enjoying the experience. "I am not asking you to cure him," she said with sudden fierce precision. "I do not believe he wants to be cured, and I do not believe that is your function. I am asking you to be here, to be present, to be a different kind of air in this house, which has been breathing the same stale grief for too long." It was at that moment, as if arranged by some theatrical instinct, that the door opened and the Duke of Whitchurch came in. He stood in the doorway, and the first thing Edith registered was not what was missing, but what was present. The sheer, controlled, formidable physical quality of him, the breadth of shoulder and the height, and the face that was a study in hard angles, a jaw like a statement, a mouth held in a line that admitted nothing. He was perhaps 32 or 33, dressed in black so precise it was almost aggressive, his dark hair thick and slightly unruly in a way that suggested he had stopped caring about it some years ago and had not changed his mind. His eyes, when they found her, were a shade of cool, clear grey, and they moved over her with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite indifference, but was somewhere in the cold territory between, the expression of a man who has decided in advance what he thinks of any new intrusion into his carefully maintained world. And then she saw his left side. The sleeve of his coat was pinned flat against his torso with Fletcher's customary neatness, and where his arm should have been, there was simply nothing, a subtraction, an absence as present as any limb. Edith made a decision in the first second and kept it for the entire length of their acquaintance. She did not look at the sleeve. She kept her eyes on his face. It was a deliberate choice made with the same pragmatic precision she brought to everything, because she understood instinctively and completely that the arm was the first thing every person who looked at him saw, and that the accumulated weight of 10 years of being seen, primarily as a man with a missing limb, was in itself a form of violence. She rose and gave a small curtsy and looked at his face. He gave her a nod so infinitesimally small it was nearly an insult, addressed a brief, clipped question about an estate matter to his aunt, and left, without having acknowledged Edith's existence in any meaningful sense, his footsteps receding down the long, cold corridor and leaving behind an absence that was somehow louder than his presence had been. "Well," said Lady Hortense, into the silence he left. "Now you know. That is the Duke of Whitchurch, and that is the Peace of Westbourne." And Edith sat back down, and her heart was beating a little faster than she would have liked, and she understood with perfect clarity that whatever she had agreed to, it was considerably more complicated than she had anticipated. Before we go further into their story, if this kind of deeply felt narrative is the reason you come here, consider subscribing and sharing this with someone who loves a story about what real courage looks like, because what comes next is the heart of it, and I do not want you to miss a moment. The first weeks at Westbourne established themselves around a strange, still rhythm, and Edith, whose greatest gift was the ability to observe without being observed, learned the geography of the house and the territory of its inhabitants with the quiet thoroughness of someone trained in diagnosis. Lady Hortense was sharp and opinionated and fiercely, gloriously intelligent, and their mornings reading the papers and their evenings in the firelit chaos of her rooms were, Edith discovered, genuinely pleasurable. A daily argument with a woman who held positions on everything from the corn laws to the proper cultivation of night-blooming jasmine, and expected to be challenged on all of them. The Duke she saw rarely, and on the periphery of her days, a tall, dark figure crossing the neglected lawns in the grey Yorkshire mornings with 2 enormous hounds at his heels, or a brief, tense presence at his aunt's door to discuss some estate matter in clipped, efficient language before withdrawing back to the north wing as a tide withdraws, leaving only the memory of its passing. He never spoke to Edith. He barely looked at her. She was, it seemed, furniture, a new piece his aunt had acquired that he had taken note of, and catalogued, and chosen not to engage with. Edith catalogued him in return, with the systematic attention she had once applied to Arthur's case notes. And what she observed was this: it was not sorrow that lived in William Beauhurst. It was rage, a cold, controlled, bottomless rage that had been burning for 10 years, and that had no outlet except the perfect punishing discipline of his isolation. This mattered. It mattered because sorrow can sometimes be outweighted, but rage needs to be met with something that does not flinch. She turned her attention, in those first weeks, to the only things she could practically affect. The household accounts were in a state of calamitous neglect, not through malice but through the specific entropy of a house, where the master had stopped caring, and the steward was elderly, and the systems had slowly, organically decomposed. She spent days in the small, cold estate office, working through ledgers with the focused calm of a woman who genuinely finds order beautiful, and she discovered an estate bleeding money. Through sheer inattention, bills paid twice, rents uncollected, repairs commissioned and forgotten, the finance of apathy. She drew up a new ledger and presented it to Lady Hortense, who peered at it through her lorgnette and said, with surprised approval, "Good heavens, child, you have a mind for figures. I thought that was a male complaint." "Order is a comfort, Your Grace," Edith replied. "Is it?" the old woman said, with that particular look of hers that suggested she was seeing something beneath the surface of the words. "Or is it a weapon against chaos?" She also reclaimed the still room and the herb garden, which had both been abandoned to cobwebs and the determined ambitions of weeds. She spent hours on her knees in the kitchen garden, with her hands gloved, pulling and pruning, and making the kind of patient physical contact with growing things that does not require any emotional intelligence whatsoever, and is therefore, she had always found, deeply restorative. She made sachets of lavender and rosemary for the damp linen. She made infusions for the dowager's variable constitution. She discovered, tucked behind the main kitchen garden, and accessible through a gate that had swollen in its frame and required considerable force to open, a large walled garden that had once, very evidently, been magnificent. The roses that grew there were overgrown past any reasonable gardening definition of the word, a tangle of ancient canes and thorns that had spent years fighting each other for the available light. But here and there, beneath the chaos, she could see the structure of old and serious cultivation, pruned stumps that had once been trained standards, the remnants of beds that had been planted with deliberate care. She began, because she could not help herself, to clear them. She had been at it for nearly 2 weeks when the Duke found her there. He came through the gate she had propped open with a stone, his 2 hounds preceding him, and then stopping in a way that suggested even they recognized this as a boundary situation, and he stood a few feet away and looked at her kneeling in the dirt, her skirts protected by a rough apron, a trowel in one hand, and a look of focused determination on her face. She looked up, startled, and a flush rose in her cheeks, and she began to rise. "Don't," he said, the word coming out sharper than he apparently intended, because something crossed his face immediately after, a brief internal recalibration. "Don't stop on my account." She settled back on her heels and rested her gloved hands on the trowel in her lap. "I am attempting to see whether the old rose varieties can be saved, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was calm. His was quieter than she had yet heard it. "My grandmother's roses," he said. He was looking at the tangled beds with an expression she could not quite read, something that was not quite memory and not quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. She tended these beds herself. She said no gardener could be trusted with them. He paused, and Edith waited, understanding that the silence between his words was the most important thing he had yet offered her. "Some of them are still strong," she said at last, keeping her voice even and observational. "They just need light and air." The words sat in the silence between them, and she felt, rather than saw, the moment they landed in him, the slight, almost imperceptible change in his posture, the way a line in his face eased by the smallest fraction. He looked from the tangled roses to her face, and she looked back, steadily and without pity, and she understood that she had said something that meant more than she had intended, and that he had heard it. She believed anything could be brought back to life with enough patience. He said, "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Edith replied. They fell silent together, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have both spent time alone and have learned that silence can be shared without becoming lonely. He stayed for perhaps another 10 minutes, watching the hounds investigate the weeds with intense professional interest. And then he said it was growing cold and she should go inside, and she agreed and gathered her tools, and he walked back through the gate. And she remained in the garden for a long moment after he was gone, her hands resting in her lap, feeling the particular quality of an interaction that has cracked something open without either party quite naming what was cracked. Inside in the estate office, she had already noticed a discrepancy in the home farm accounts that needed addressing, and it had given her an idea about how to create a second encounter with him, on ground where she knew she could hold her own. She had, in Arthur's years of practice, become a reasonably good diagnostician herself. She knew what she was looking at. She knew what the treatment needed to look like. She knew, above all, that the treatment could not look like treatment, or the patient would refuse it entirely. The matter of the tenant's roof came to a head on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into her time at Westbourne, when she discovered during her review of the maintenance records that a family of 8 in one of the estate cottages had been living under a roof that was visibly, dangerously failing, that the steward had been informed of this twice, and that nothing had been done. She went to Fletcher, the Duke's valet, who had served with William in the Peninsula, and who communicated primarily through silences of varying quality. She explained the situation. He looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a man reviewing a tactical assessment, and then he led her, without a word, to the door of a small, cold room in the north wing that she had not previously had occasion to enter. The Duke was there, bent over a half-assembled clock mechanism with a jeweler's loop in his eye, his single right hand moving among the tiny components with a precision that was clearly the product of enormous, painstaking effort. He looked up when she entered, removed the loop, and waited. She laid out the situation with the clean efficiency of a medical report. The leak, the compromised timbers, the family, the imminent winter, the steward's inaction. She did not appeal to his conscience, or his sense of duty, or his compassion. She brought him a sheet of paper on which she had drafted a cost estimate for immediate repairs, compared it to the substantially higher cost of allowing the damage to compound, and presented him with a recommended course of action, including the name of a local builder with a reliable record. He took the paper. He studied it. His grey eyes moved down the columns with the concentrated attention of someone who is actually reading, rather than performing the act of reading, and the room was very quiet. And outside the window, the Yorkshire sky was the particular flat white of imminent rain. "You did not come to me wringing your hands over the plight of the poor," he said at last, looking up at her. "You came to me with a ledger and a solution." Why? She chose her words with care. "Because a leaking roof on your property is a matter of responsible management, Your Grace," she said. "The plight of the poor is a matter for charity. They are not the same thing." Something crossed his face, and it was the ghost of a smile, the barest flicker of an expression that was not bitterness, and it was the most startling thing she had seen since her arrival. He sent Fletcher for the builder and dispatched a cart of dry firewood and blankets to the farm that same afternoon. When she returned to the dowager's rooms, Lady Hortense looked at her over the rim of her teacup and said, "You are good for him, Edith. You do not treat him like a broken thing." Edith felt a warmth in her chest that she was careful not to examine too closely. "I see a man who has endured a great deal," she said. "Pity," said Lady Hortense with sudden, passionate venom, "is a useless and corrosive emotion. It is an insult dressed as kindness. What William needs is not pity. He needs a reason to come out of the dark. I am an old woman, and I have been afraid he would never find one. That night, for the first time, Edith allowed herself to think about the Duke not as a problem to be managed, but as William, a man trapped not primarily by the loss of his arm, but by the loss of his world, by 10 years of being looked at with the particular combination of horror and pity that had slowly, inexorably taught him that showing himself was a form of suffering. And she, in her quiet and practical way, was standing at the edge of his darkness, holding a candle, not dragging him toward it, just standing. She did not know if he would choose to walk toward the light, but for the first time she felt the possibility of it, trembling and fragile as a new flame in a cold room. What she did not know, because he was very careful that she should not know it, was that from the window of his study, William Bowhurst had watched her walking in the gardens every morning for 3 weeks, with the focused attention of a man who has tried very hard to be interested in nothing, and has discovered, to his considerable inconvenience, that he has failed. He had watched her from the shadows the way he watched everything, from a safe remove, through glass, behind a careful layer of insulation from the world. He had spent 10 years perfecting this remove. He had built the walls of his isolation with the same methodical precision he brought to everything, stone by stone, refusal by refusal, withdrawal by withdrawal, until the world outside the north wing had become an abstraction, a thing that happened elsewhere to other people who had not had the misfortune of learning, in the most immediate and physical way possible, how quickly and completely a single moment can dismantle everything you believed yourself to be. The peninsula had taught him many things, most of which he would have given a great deal to unlearn. It had taught him what the human body looks like under extreme duress. It had taught him what the voice of a young man sounds like when he understands that he is dying, and more specifically, that the young man 3 feet to his left, with whom he had played cards the previous evening and discussed the particular demerits of army bread, was now dying, and that he, William Bowhurst, was still alive and would go on being alive, while Thomas Harlow, who had been 20 years old and had a mother and a sweetheart in Shropshire, would not. This was the knowledge that lived in him like an infection, the deep, abiding, shameful knowledge of his own survival. He had come home with his arm gone and this knowledge intact, and the arm he could live without. It was the knowledge that was killing him. He had not been able to explain this to anyone. He had not for 10 years tried. People saw the sleeve, and they understood they were seeing something hard, something to be responded to with careful solicitousness and lowered voices, and he had come to understand that their pity, however well-intentioned, was a mirror in which he saw only what he had lost, never what remained. He had stopped looking in mirrors. He had stopped appearing in rooms where mirrors existed. He had stopped appearing in rooms at all. And then Mrs. Reeve arrived, and she would not look at the sleeve. He had noticed this on the first day, and he had told himself it was a deliberate affectation, a strategy of some kind, some approach the aunt had advised, and he had filed it away with contempt. But the contempt did not quite take, because day after day she came and went through his peripheral awareness, and she continued not to look at the sleeve. And eventually he understood that it was not an affectation at all. It was simply that she was genuinely more interested in other things. The quality of this was so strange to him, so quietly revolutionary, that he found he had to sit with it for a considerable time before he could identify what it was. She did not come to his workshop with the roof problem as a plea for his mercy. She came with a cost analysis. She did not speak to him in the walled garden with any of the careful, over-managed delicacy that people deployed around him. She spoke about roses and what they needed, and the words landed in him with a force she could not have known she was delivering. He found himself manufacturing reasons to be in rooms where she might be. He went to the library at hours he had calculated she was likely to be there, and he sat with a book and did not read it. and felt the quality of the silence in the room change when she was present, the empty silence of his solitude becoming something else, a shared, quiet and inhabited space, and he found this simultaneously unbearable and desperately necessary. He understood, in very significant trouble. The argument with his aunt about the Ashworth Assembly was the fracture through which something deeper finally broke through. They had been discussing the annual assembly hosted by Sir John and Lady Ashworth, which his aunt attended every year as a matter of social principle, and this year she wanted him to come. He refused with the cold precision he had applied to every similar request for 10 years, and she pressed harder than usual, which suggested she knew something he didn't about the urgency of the situation, and something in him that had been maintained under enormous pressure for a very long time finally gave way, and the word came out before he could stop it. Freak. He used it about himself, the word he had seen in the averted eyes and the sudden silences and the carefully modulated expressions of people who had looked at him in those early years. After his return, the secret ugly word that was the true shape of what the world thought of him. The room went very still. Lady Hortense's face did something complicated. He turned on his heel and left. He went to the ballroom, which he always went to when the pressure became too much, because the ballroom was the most perfectly dead room in the house. The room where nothing could touch him. The pousse past was so complete and so finished that even his own grief felt appropriate in it. He stood in the center of the vast, dusty, draped space in the failing light from the grimy windows and looked at his own faint reflection in a tarnished mirror and felt the full weight of what he had become, the magnificent ruin of a man, a duke in a ballroom that had not seen dancing in 10 years and would not see it again, because the master of the house was a ghost and everyone knew it, and everyone accepted it, and eventually everyone would stop expecting anything different. He heard her before he saw her. She had a way of moving through spaces that was neither tentative nor aggressive, a purposeful, even quality to her step that he had come to recognize the way you come to recognize the particular quality of a light you have learned to read. If you have come to lecture me on duty, Mrs. Reeve, he said, without turning, you may save your breath. I have not come to speak of duty, she said. Her voice was steady. I have come to speak of courage. That made him turn. She was standing a few feet away in the dimness, her gaze direct and clear and entirely without pity, and she said things to him then that no one had said before. Not his aunt, not Fletcher, not the doctors, not the old friends who'd had tried and been repelled in the early years. She named what lived in him. She said there is the courage of the battlefield, and then there is the other kind, the harder kind, the courage to walk back into a world that looks at you and sees only what you have lost, to stand in a room full of whispers and hold your head up and refuse to be defined by the worst thing that ever happened to you. She said, the bravest thing a soldier can sometimes do is come home. She said you are more than your injury. She said it the way she said everything, not as comfort but as assessment, as if she had looked at the evidence and arrived at a conclusion and was now simply reporting her findings. He did not answer her. He stood in the dead ballroom with his fist clenched at his side and looked at her as if she were an equation he could not solve, a variable he had not accounted for in the long, bleak calculation of his life. And she held his gaze for a moment longer, and then gave a small nod and walked away, leaving him alone with her words and the dark. He remained in the ballroom for a long time after she left. Then he went to find Fletcher and told him to have his evening clothes laid out for the following week. The decision, when it came, was not a gradual thing. It was a door opening. He did not tell anyone what had opened it, but he knew, with the clarity of a man who has spent 10 years in silence and has therefore become very accurate about the rare things that reach him, that it was her. It was the words she had left behind in the dark, which had kept finding him in the weeks since, in the quiet of his workshop, in the middle of the night, on the cold terrace in the mornings when the mist lay over the park and the hounds breathed steam at his knees. He had not been able to put them down. This is the thing no one tells you about real courage. It is almost always given to you by someone else first, and you carry it back into the world on their behalf until it becomes your own. Keep watching to see how Edith carries hers, and if her story moves you, tell us which city you are watching from, and leave a comment for someone else who needs to hear it. The night of the Ashworth Assembly was cold and clear, the stars like chips of ice in the black Yorkshire sky, and Edith did not know until the very last moment whether he would come. She had dressed carefully in her deep grey silk, which was modest and honest, and the best she owned, and she sat with Lady Hortense in the Dowager's drawing room and watched the clock and said nothing, because some situations require silence more than speech, and this was one of them. The Dowager sat in her purple velvet and her formidable diamonds and did not speak either, and the carriage was ordered, and the appointed hour arrived, and the master of the house was nowhere to be seen. "He's not coming," Lady Hortense said, in the flat voice of a woman, announcing a verdict she had been expecting, and then the door opened, and Fletcher stood in it. And behind Fletcher was William. He was dressed in immaculate evening black, a coat of the finest wool, a waistcoat of white silk, a cravat tied with stark mathematical precision, and he looked like something from a Gothic novel, the dark and brooding lord emerging at last from his tower, and he was terrifying and magnificent, and his empty sleeve was pinned with its usual neatness, and he addressed his aunt with the clipped authority of someone who has made a decision and has no interest in discussing it. "The carriage is waiting. We should not be late." Lady Hortense's face, for the briefest and most unguarded moment Edith had ever seen in it, was simply a grandmother's face, astonished and relieved and proud. They travelled to Larchwood Park in near total silence. The lights of the Ashworth house blazed out into the cold night air from every window, and the sound of music and laughter reached them in the carriage before they were through the gates, and Edith felt a tremor of something, not quite fear and not quite apprehension, but the feeling of standing at the edge of something consequential. She looked at William. His face was pale and set and absolutely composed, and she understood that every muscle in his body was held in tension, that the performance of aristocratic calm he was producing was costing him significantly, and she felt a fierce private surge of respect for the discipline it required. Their entrance into the ballroom produced the effect she had anticipated and he had not fully accounted for. A wave of silence moved through the room from the door outward, and then broke into a rising tide of whispers, the way a stone dropped into still water sends out its rings. Every head turned. Every eye in the room came to rest on the Duke of Whitchurch, the mythical recluse, the wounded hero, returned from the dead. They looked at his face, his bearing, his black coat, and then, inevitably, at his left side. He stood on the threshold for a full, composed moment, his gaze sweeping the room with the expression of a man surveying a landscape, acknowledging everything and finding nothing that moved him. And then he offered his right arm to his aunt, and they moved into the room. Edith followed, a small grey shadow in their wake, and she felt the whispers like a physical pressure, like bad weather. The poor man. I never thought to see him again. They say he is not right in the head. They gave him a wide berth, the crowd, parting before him and closing behind, keeping a careful distance as though proximity to his pain might be contagious. He installed his aunt in a chair near the patronesses, settled himself beside her, and stood there like a sentinel over a territory no one wanted to claim. The evening wore on, the music played, the dancers swirled, and William received the few brave men who approached him to pay respects with the cold civility of someone fulfilling a contractual obligation, brief, formal, utterly uninformative. No one asked him to dance. The idea was, apparently, unthinkable. He was a monument, not a man, an object of historical and morbid interest, and the room arranged itself around him accordingly, in a careful perimeter of pretended indifference. And then Edith saw Quincy Bowhurst across the room. He was William's cousin, the heir presumptive, a handsome man with the particular kind of easy, practiced charm that comes from never having had any reason to develop substance, and he was standing in a small court of admirers watching William with a smile on his face that was the most genuinely repellent thing Edith had seen in her life. It was a smile of confirmation, of satisfied prediction, of a man watching something collapse in the way he always knew it would, and finding this deeply gratifying. Something in Edith went very quiet and very clear, the particular quality of mind she associated with Arthur's most complex diagnostic moments, the feeling of seeing through the surface of a situation to the thing underneath it. The orchestra struck up a waltz, the floor filled with color and movement, and the particular brilliance of women who are happy, and William stood at the edge of it like a man standing at the edge of a country he has been exiled from, and Edith made a decision. She took the 2 steps that separated them. She stood before him. Her heart was hammering against her ribs in a way she chose to find irrelevant. He looked down at her, his grey eyes questioning, a flicker of something that was not quite alarm but lived near it in his expression. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was low, intended for his ears alone, and it was clear, and it was steady because this was not a moment for uncertainty. "You told me once that you could no longer dance." His face tightened. He thought he knew what she was about to ask. "You did not say," she continued, and her voice was very quiet, "that you could not stand on a dance floor with a friend." She did not offer him her hand. She did not gesture toward the dancers. She simply stood before him, her eyes on his, full of a trust and a clarity that said, "I know exactly what I am asking, and I know exactly who you are, and I am not afraid of either," and waited. He stared at her. The ballroom noise faded, or seemed to. There was only her face, her calm and courageous eyes, the word she had used, friend. It moved through the silent, locked chambers of his heart like light through a keyhole, and the question was no longer about the dance floor, or the room, or the whispers. The question was whether he was willing to be seen by her in the full view of the world, as himself, not as the Duke, not as the wound, but as the man who repaired clocks and read Tacitus and had once, many years ago, known how to laugh, and who was, it turned out, still in there beneath all the distance and the rage and the careful, practiced absence. He gave a single, stiff nod. He turned and walked toward the dance floor, and Edith fell into step beside him, and together they moved through the fringe of onlookers, the mouths going slack with astonishment, and they walked to the very edge of the swirling mass of dancers and stopped. He stood straight and still and absolutely present. Edith stood beside him. They did not touch, they did not speak. They simply stood together in the middle of the most social room in the county, while the waltz soared around them, 2 quiet figures refusing to be invisible or to pretend that the world's terms were the only terms available. The whispers changed their character. The staring changed its quality. People were looking not with pity now, not with morbid curiosity, but with the particular, hushed attention of people witnessing something they do not have a category for, something that makes them feel that they have misunderstood the nature of a courage. The music swelled to its crescendo and fell into applause, and in the silence that followed, William turned his head and looked at her, a real look, a look of gratitude so deep and so unguarded that she felt it like something physical, and at the corner of his mouth there was the ghost of a smile, a small, real, undefended thing, the first she had seen in him, and it was a beginning. In the coach going home, in the quiet dark, with Lady Hortense pretending to sleep in her corner and doing an excellent job of it, Edith sat across from William, and neither of them spoke, and the quality of the silence was entirely different from anything that had come before. At the door of the Dowager's drawing room he stopped and said, "Mrs. Reeve," and she said, "Your Grace," and he said, "Thank you," and she said there was no need for thanks, that she had been glad to stand with her friend, using the word again deliberately, and something shifted in his face, some guard came down by some incremental but irreversible degree, and he said, quietly, "My name is William," and she said, "Mine is Edith." and they looked at each other in the lamplight of the corridor, and it was another door, and they both knew it. What followed was the gradual, stubborn, beautiful resurrection of a man and a house. William emerged from the north wing, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the careful, methodical way of someone who has been in the dark for a long time and is relearning the management of light. He began taking breakfast in the small morning room adjoining the Dowager's suite, initially in silence over his newspaper, but present, there, a new and permanent fact in the household's daily equation. He began walking the estate with genuine managerial attention rather than mere solitary exercise, and the decisions he had been postponing for years began to be made. The old steward was retired with a generous pension, and a new man hired younger and more capable. He brought Edith into his planning in a way that started as consultation about the human arithmetic of the estate, which tenants were reliable, which families were struggling, and expanded into something larger, a genuine collaborative working relationship in which their different competencies were genuinely complementary. He brought the maps and plans to the library table, and they worked there together, his single hand moving with slow, practiced precision, her voice reading titles down from the ladder, the air between them full of the quiet sounds of shared work, which is one of the most intimate things two people can share. One afternoon he came into the library and found her struggling with a heavy box of books on a high shelf. He said, "Allow me," and reached up with his right arm and held the box steady, his jaw tight, his whole body concentrated on the effort, and when he had brought it safely down and stood there breathing slightly harder than usual, she looked at the box and said, simply, "The folio editions of Dryden." I knew they would be heavy, and did not look at him, and did not make it a moment, and did not turn his effort into an occasion for any emotion whatsoever. He looked at her then, and what was in his face was relief so profound it had no other expression, and she understood that in that small, ordinary act of not making something into a thing, she had given him something he had not had for a very long time. He still wore his injury like a fact of himself, an undeniable and permanent fact. The phantom pains came on damp nights, and the frustrations of managing in a world built for two-handed people were real and daily and never wholly resolved. But the black rage was quieting, being replaced gradually by something that required more courage than the rage had, a grudging, hard-won, earned acceptance of himself as he actually was. He was learning to live in the world as he was, and he was doing it. Edith came to understand with a certainty she recognized as diagnostic, because she was there to witness it, because her steady, unpitying presence gave him a space in which to be imperfect and human, and still worth something. They walked for hours in the park with the dogs running ahead. They talked about books and drainage, and the political situation, and the restoration of the West Garden, and the proper management of a small but viable home farm. He had a fine, dry wit he had kept carefully hidden for 10 years, and when it emerged, it was like finding a window in a sealed room. She told him stories of her life with Arthur, of her unlikely expertise in account management, of the satisfaction she found in the imposition of order on chaos, and she spoke of it all without sorrow, as simply the country she had traveled to arrive at this. She understood one early spring morning, while walking beside him on the wet terrace with the park, emerging from its winter through the mist, the closest thing to companions that either of them had had in years, and it was both the most comfortable and the most dangerous realization she had had since arriving at Westbourne. She was falling in love with him. The understanding came not in a flash, but in the way of all true knowledge, slowly, with the quality of something that has been true for longer than you knew it, settling into certainty the way a house settles into its foundations. She loved his mind, the precision and the range of it. She loved his resilience, the daily, undramatic courage of it. She loved the way he had learned to look at her, as if she were the only person in the room who was not trying to manage him. She loved, if she was being completely honest with herself, and she was a woman who had found that honesty is the only genuine economy. The way the ghost of his smile had become a little less ghostly with every passing week, and the way it was reserved for her. He was a duke and she was a paid companion, and the gulf between them was enormous, and she was acutely, constantly aware of it, and she would not. She had decided with the firmness of a woman protecting something she valued, ever be the one to presume. And then he asked her to walk with him to the walled garden in early March, and she went, and the garden was transformed. He had hired new gardeners over the winter. The overgrown beds were cleared, the paths weeded, the old fruit trees pruned to their elegant bones, and the rose bushes, the ones she had despaired of, were covered in tight green buds, the first declarations of new life. They stood together in the center of the garden, and it was beautiful, and it was the most deliberate thing he had done since she arrived. And he was not looking at the garden, he was looking at her. He said quietly that she had been very patient, and she started to say something about the garden, and he said, just as quietly, that he was not talking about the garden. He stepped closer. He was close enough that she could see the silver threading into his dark hair and the full, complex gray of his eyes. He said that for 10 years he had been a ghost, that he had haunted this house and haunted himself, that he had believed that was all that was left for him, a life in the shadows, and then she had come and walked into his darkness and had not tried to drag him out of it, had simply lit a candle and waited. He reached out his hand, not to touch her, but to show her something, the gesture of a man making an accounting. He said he was not the man he was, that the war had taken that man, and that the pinned sleeve was part of him now and would always be part of him, and that he would never be whole in the way the world understood wholeness. And then he looked into her eyes and said, "But when I am with you, Edith, I do not feel broken. I feel seen. I feel possible." She had known she was going to have to be brave, and she was. She told him she did not see a wounded duke when she looked at him. She told him she saw the man who read Tacitus in the original Latin, who had the patience to repair a clock with one hand, who had stood in a ballroom and faced down 100 whispers because a friend had asked him to. She told him she saw a man of strength and honor and genuine, well-defended kindness. And then she told him she saw the man she loved and said it clearly, without qualification, the most terrifying and honest words she had ever spoken in her life, her heart placed in his hands with no knowledge of what he would do with it. He stared at her. His face was very still. There was one long, terrible, silent moment in which she understood with complete clarity what she had risked, and then, slowly, he raised his right hand. He cupped her cheek in his palm, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a care that suggested someone handling something infinitely precious and wholly unprecedented, and he said her name, just her name, in a voice that held everything he had been unable to say for 10 years, and he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a passionate kiss. It was something more serious than passion. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, of recognition, of a man arriving somewhere he had not known he was traveling toward, and it was the sealing of a pact between two people who had each been reduced and rebuilt and had chosen, out of all available options, each other. When he drew back, his eyes were bright, and he said he did not know if he was worthy of her love, but that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be. Edith, who had learned to be an accurate observer of the world, knew a true statement when she heard one. She believed him completely. In the quiet of the resurrected garden, surrounded by rosebuds and the smell of new earth and the distant sound of the hounds in the park, they stood in the beginning of their life together, which was not a romantic invention, but a real and specific and entirely possible thing that two actual, damaged, capable people had built in the ruins of a great sleeping house, piece by piece, through patience and honesty, and the particular courage that is required to be seen. 1 year later, in the morning room at Westbourne, the sun came through the clean tall windows and lay in bright bars across the polished table, and a letter arrived addressed in flowing hand to Her Grace the Duchess of Whitchurch. Edith slit the envelope open, read Lady Ashworth's latest invitation, and smiled. Across the table, William was reading his steward's report, the new steward's neat, efficient report, his dark head bent, the morning light finding the silver at his temples, his left sleeve pinned with Fletcher's customary neatness, his face wearing the expression she thought of privately as his ordinary face, the one that was not performing or defending or managing, the one that lived in the quiet of their daily life and was, she had come to understand, his real face. He still had the phantom pains on damp nights. He still experienced, and probably always would, the particular frustrations of a world built for two-handed people. The war was in him still, as it would always be, a scar on his soul as permanent and as constitutive as anything on his body. Love had not cured him. Love had done something more honest and more difficult. It had made a space in which he could be whole with his wounds, in which the wound was part of him without being the whole of him, in which there was room for the man who repaired clocks and read Latin and walked the park in the mornings, and had, it turned out, a great capacity for the ordinary daily pleasures of a life shared well. He looked up, feeling her gaze, and the small, familiar, almost smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, the one that was reserved for her. Another summons from Lady Ashworth? Indeed, Edith said, folding the letter with the brisk composure of a woman who has put Lady Ashworth's assembly in its correct proportion. She requests the honor of our company. And what shall her grace reply? He asked with the particular quality of teasing that she had come to treasure above most things, because it was the evidence of the man who had been waiting 10 years inside the Duke, and who had finally, patiently been allowed to come home. She set the invitation on the table, and looked at him across it, and across the year of ordinary mornings they had spent in this room together, the maps unrolled between them, and the accounts reviewed, and the tenants' concerns addressed, and the books read, and the dogs sleeping at their feet, and the dowager in her armchair by the fire making sharp, correct observations about everything. And she felt the whole weight of how much had been made, from how little, from a letter and a coach, and a woman with a trowel and a man, with a candle and two people who had each, in their different ways, been brave enough to stand still and be seen. Her Grace thinks she might enjoy a dance, she said. William rose from his chair and came around the table and stood behind her, his hand warm on her shoulder, and together they looked out of the morning window. At the grounds of Westbourne, the parkland no longer a wilderness but a landscape under deliberate, loving management, the house alive behind them, its windows shining, its rooms open, the chandelier in the entrance hall unswathed and blazing, the walled garden visible in the middle distance with its roses in their second year of vigorous new growth. "Then we shall go," he said, his voice low and content against her hair, "and this time I believe the Duke of Whitchurch might even know the steps." They had built a world, the two of them, not on grand passion, though there was that, but on the quieter and more durable materials, shared work, honest speech, the willingness to see and be seen, and the particular, radical act of choosing every morning to be present. The house breathed around them, steady and warm and awake. If this story reached you, if Edith's courage or William's reminded you of something true, please share it with someone who needs it. Leave a comment to tell us what it made you feel, and subscribe so you never miss a story about what it actually looks like when people choose each other, because those are the stories worth telling. And there are more where this one came from.